Americans trust heroes. The English would not be able to give Superman that sort of glorious crown that Americans give him of, yes, you can go off in your lovely suit and your wonderful flappy cape and you can fight for truth, justice in the American way and you can represent us. Then you discover that actually they spent 50 years molesting small children and you just sort of go, I don't want any part of this hero thing.
I love violence. Even if it's overly indulgent or out of place, it's an act of transgression that gives anything a sudden sense of personality, like a new dimension of the art is tapped into, because violence is a naked look into the story's soul, and for one moment you can see the intentions of the entire tone. Either it's driven by comedy, playfulness, emotional poignancy, or horror. Violence done right is an opportunity. It's another character for the creator to articulate something specific with. And more importantly, have fun while doing something complex. In the case of Dredd, gory violence is like an awareness test for the audience. Do you recognize what violence means in this world that's been created, or do you just accept it like the rest of the characters? Because violence as a test pretty much sums up the goals of Dredd's satire.
She a pass or a fail?
Defining satire is a bit weird because of how it can operate in such varying extremes. It can be unbelievably dry, but it can also be extremely overt and farcical because, as being described by the A-Team over here, satire is the social indictment through playful means, transforming the aggressive act of ridicule into a more socially acceptable act of rendering something ridiculous. And Judge Dredd as a character in his very bones is sort of the ultimate British eye-rolling cynical satire on American political innocence, because that's just British culture in general, the ultimate deposit of casual cynicism. Unlike the Americans, there's no real working popularist dynamic. Any sense of optimistic national dream on where the establishment can take us doesn't really work here because everyone just hates politicians.
You like a cup of tea?
Yeah, sure.
Judge Dredd himself is an ironic sort of sly creation that is sort of emblematic of this very mood. A futuristic fascist cop who polices a post-apocalyptic degrading world with a cruel, unempathetic, authoritarian approach evocative of communism.
If you have a fascist state, the hero is a fascist cop. There's a built-in satire in that. You don't really need to do anything else. It's all embedded within that idea. Dredd is, apart from the fact that there's a lot of aggression within it, it's basically subversive. It's taking the piss.
And that's part of his inherent satirical edge. He's a character that's a response to 80s Thatcher Britain. By both concept and representation, Judge Dredd sort of highlights the cold disconnect between the people making the rules and those who have to live with it.
Sir, Peachtree's houses 75,000 registered citizens. It has the highest crime rate in Sector 13, unemployment rate at 96%. And more than half the residential levels here are classed as slums.
Incendiary.
The satire in Dredd is sort of brilliantly discreet in articulating the satirical view that's deeply embedded in the premise, because Alex Garland understands that the premise of the character naturally indicts authority, and violence is the tool to communicate this in the film. Blood is this constant visual character that submerges the mood of the film into a constant low baseline of emotions. The story quietly but constantly intervenes with so many moments of action with details that compromise the sense of satisfaction in scenes of violence. The most obvious scene is when Anderson has to execute the polo shirt guy, which moments before we had a really quick gunfight that sort of roused you up for some sweet, cathartic, criminals getting what they deserved action. But the scene slows down immediately and breathes in the entire situation. It lets you see the human doubt in her eyes and the fragility in his. Who's the real villain here? The guy who we know is a subject to poverty and is also looking after his wife and child within such an intensely crime culture ridden environment? Or is it the system that simply doesn't care? On paper, it's a pretty cliched moment, but what makes it refreshingly and all the more poignant is that the story doesn't make a massive deal about it. We don't have Anderson rebel against authority and become a fugitive and start a revolution that fixes society like in so many other famous American totalitarian science fiction fables. Instead, like the real world, there's no big dream of change, just instead learning to breathe under a heavy miasma. Which then also highlights the central conflict to the story, which is stopping the production of slow-mo, an illegal drug that makes people momentarily escape this world by seeing everything beautifully. In the film, it's the one pathway of creative escapism, where something as simple and as mundane as water or the sight of blood, it becomes special. But because of outdated laws, it's illegal, and because of the harshness of those that enforce it, people die because of it.
The message about that drug is complicated. It's not really a just say no to this drug film. The drug itself is captivating, kind of enticing, it's overtly beautiful. And that's using the drug a bit like Dredd as an anti-hero.
Yeah.
Like, what position is the film taking on that drug? What position is the film taking on Dredd?
In fact, there's not much separating Dredd and Anderson from the rest of the gangs. He dethrones the main antagonist in the same way that she dethroned her predecessors, with exhibitions of brute force and pragmatic cruelty. He throws her off the balcony to express his dominance in the same way she did right at the beginning.
Skin him. Toss him over the balcony.
The only difference is that crime in this world is an organic consequence of society, but Dredd represents a system that is unnaturally destructive and it actually halts progress. And for that we see how superficial that difference truly is. The big demon of society highlighted here isn't poverty, drugs, or the lack of economic opportunities for working class people, but is the idea of the criminal. In quotation marks. I need to remember to put quotation marks in the editing. Whatever. As the audience, we identify ourselves with Dredd because he looks like a superhero, the film's title is named after him, and we follow him rise to the top, literally. We don't identify ourselves with the criminals, even though they are technically the victims of the situations. They're the ones that are so technologically outmatched that they have to get ripped off by corrupt judges to even momentarily stand a chance.
1 million credits.
Million.
We take comfort in not seeing the world through their eyes. All the pretty symbols and blame that society and politics has found comfort in generalizing working class people as the problem with pushing a negative pathological social identity into them, are spotlighted here by the text itself, because violence is the articulation of this specific ignorance, and the film never overtly talks about it because that's the point. It takes this little quiet sociological truth and blows it out into a mad little action film that exposes the nuances. In the same way that Anderson is on assessment in the story, we, the audience, are being assessed by the film.
She's a pass.
One more thing, looking back on 2018, there's a weird arrogance to how loud politics has gotten in popular culture, where rather than using social topics and politics as a resource for honest creative exploration, is it me or it seems like the opposite seems to occur more often, where like fiction is used as a resource for political messages instead. It's like this approach feels incredibly insincere, alienating, and so insanely propagandistic that I think looking back on Dredd when I was writing this, that kind of shocked by how quaint this film feels, because it doesn't have this hostility to its political convictions. It shows us that a way to articulate a political position doesn't just come from the words or even the events. Sometimes it's just the unspoken attitude woven into the soul, which is what makes it even more moving. And the violence in Dredd is a storytelling tool that lets you decide what the politics mean. I'm not sure about you, but that's always a more convincing argument.